What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Whoop podcast, where we sit down with top performers, athletes, researchers, scientists, and more on a mission to unlock human performance. That's right. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop. And this week's episode, Whoop VP of Performance Science, Principal Scientist Kristen Holmes, is joined by Dr. Guy Winch. The licensed psychologist and author is a relationship and emotional health expert with one of the most highly regarded TED Talks in the business. Kristen and Dr. Guy will discuss how Guy began researching emotional health, the approach and skills needed to improve emotional health. For example, simply expressing gratitude once a day can be a major driver. How to deal with rumination, the connection of breath work and stress to emotional health. They touch on how important the breath and heart are to signal relaxation to the brain. This is fascinating. Getting space to grieve properly, redeveloping self-esteem after a failure or breakup, have to work to fill the holes in your identity that have been created by a loss or breakup. That's a key theme. Ways to have a good work-life balance. They touched on the pros and cons of working from home and how the pandemic has opened people's eyes to the importance of connection. A reminder, if you're new to Whoop, use the code WILL, W-I-L-L, when you're checking out. Get a $60 credit on Whoop accessories. That is join.whoop.com. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us, podcast@whoop.com. Call us, 508-443-4952. Here are Kristen Holmes and Dr. Guy Winch.
Dr. Guy Winch is a licensed psychologist, author, and keynote speaker whose books have been translated into 30 languages. His first TED Talk, Why We All Need to Practice Emotional First Aid, has been viewed over 13 million times and is rated as the 5th most inspiring talk of all time on TED.com. Dr. Winch's work has been featured in outlets such as the Boston Globe, NPR, The Atlantic, and Business Insider. Dr. Guy received his PhD in clinical psychology from New York University, did postdoctoral work at NYU Medical Center, and opened a full-time private practice.
So Whoop is not just a wearable for athletes or those looking to improve their performance. It is a comprehensive tool that helps people evaluate how various behaviors, habits, and patterns in their life can manifest both physiologically and psychologically. But honestly, I feel like what gets a lot of attention is the training behavior side and how we recover from training. But I think what is really missing from the conversation is the mental and emotional side and how that moves around our physical health. Dr. Guy Winch, so happy to have you here to kind of discuss and go deep on all things emotional health. We really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd love to start off by just talking a little bit about your history. What got you excited and really going down the path of the science behind emotional health?
So I was always interested in psychology, and when I got my PhD, during that training, it became very clear to me that I'm actually not that interested in psychopathology. In other words, severe schizophrenia or bipolar or, very severe psychopathology interested me less. What interested me more was everything that happened before a diagnostic category. So to be classified as having, a major depression, you have to have this many criteria out of this many. But if you're missing one of those criteria, you're not officially depressed. But boy, are you depressed. And it always seemed to me that the preventative side of things, everyone who's suffering before they get officially, and if they ever do get officially diagnosed, all the regular slings and arrows of regular life, we don't really address things like loneliness or heartbreak or rejection or stress, even rumination. That's not something that gets a diagnostic category that insurance reimburses on. And to me, it was much more compelling. How do we help people avoid getting mentally ill? How do we help people live a much more thriving life? And I consider that emotional health, with a line to mental health coming at the diagnostic point. So I was always interested in emotional health. And then when I graduated and started my practice, I kept into the habit of, it was a PhD, it's a research degree, and I kept the habit of looking at the research. And there was a lot of research about emotional health, things that are not about the mental health aspect of things. And I started taking that research and seeing if I could translate it into tools or interventions that I could offer my patients. And then I would see which resonated, which worked. And I slowly began to acquire this toolkit of interventions, of tools, techniques, tricks, mind hacks to really boost our emotional health. And, over the decades, the research has really mushroomed in so many different ways. But that's how I really started getting into the science of emotional health and what it can do and what it can teach us.
So I guess it's safe to say that you see it really as, an opportunity to build skills. Um, what would you say are, if you were to kind of a laundry list of skills that help buoy emotional health, what would be a few that you would want to highlight?
So I'm going to mention a few, but before I do, I want to mention the approach. And you're talking about physiological, like athletes. You're talking about athletes, you're talking about training. Well, when you're trying to push yourself to achieve certain physiological milestones in running, in whatever the sport is, the idea that you would be able to do that without training is ridiculous. Of course, you have to train. And to the extent that your goals are far from where you are presently, you have to train quite a bit. That should be the approach to emotional health. It's not a part-time thing. It's something that we need to be aware of and we need to be mindful of and we need to practice every single day because life happens every single day. So if we want to be healthier emotionally, that's something we have to be aware of. A few of the things that I practice every day, and I recommend everyone does, for example, and these are all evidence-based scientifically. So gratitude is an amazing thing because we evolved to look out for danger. There wasn't an evolutionary advantage to being happy. You can pass along your genes whether you're happy or not. There was to scouting the horizon for dangers. And so we're much more biased in that direction. We will pay attention to the negative much more than to the positive. We will note what's lacking in our lives much more easily than we will what we have. And so gratitude exercises are a way of balancing that aspect of things a bit by on a daily basis noting the things for which we're grateful. And the best way to do that is in narrative form. It's not just about sitting down and going, well, I'm glad it's sunny. All right, you're glad it's sunny, but are you not grateful for the sun? Because the sun will rise or not based on your gratitude. You can be grateful it's a sunny day because for you that is associated with well-being and the outdoor season beginning, and you like the feel of the sun on your skin. And so you can craft a little bit of a story. It doesn't have to be a long one. But the best way to practice gratitude is jot down a paragraph a day about something you're grateful for and why, and do it in a little bit of a story of why that matters to you. That little exercise, it takes 5 minutes, has such profound effects on our optimism, on our happiness, on our truly emotional health, and our physiological health, because they're obviously connected, which we'll get to. So gratitude is one thing that I practice every day, and I highly recommend that people do.
And is there a difference between what's happening kind of in the brain when you're receiving gratitude versus kind of giving gratitude?
So I can't quite speak to that. I don't do functional MRI studies. I read
Okay.
them, and the way they are done. Actually, I was having a conversation with somebody who does that research, because the way that's typically done is you'll have somebody lie in the functional MRI and think of something they're grateful for. It doesn't necessarily get prompted to be done in narrative form. The form that I suggest, and if you want to get the most bang out of your buck, and this is not something you can do every day, but for once in a while, if you want a real lift for mood and for everything, then think about someone who was really meaningful, influential, helpful, did something that really made a difference to you over your life. In your life at some point. It can be 30 years ago. It can be something small. They had no idea it was having that impact, but you were having that kind of day with that small thing. And write them a letter telling them what the context was for you, what they did, whether they remember that or not, and the impact that had on you. That evokes really powerful gratitude because you're thinking about it in the context of your life and in the context of what it did. And it's often people who, and I've done that a number of times already, and many of the times people like not even quite sure they remember what I'm talking about. But it's even more impactful for them because then they realize, oh, I did this small thing. I had no idea it had that significant an impact. So I hope they study those kinds of things in the functional MRI, because reading or writing a letter like that while you're lying there, that will, I think, activate perhaps other areas of the brain that the regular one does not. So, but this is still something that we're, obviously researching and trying
Yeah.
to understand fully how that works.
So interesting. Okay, so gratitude. Excellent. What would you say is the next skill that you would recommend for
Okay,
emotional health?
so because it's emotional health, and
Mhm.
there's as many, if not more, don't do's as there are do's. And so, because, like I said, our tendency, we evolved for certain purposes that were not quite suited for modern day life. And so, this tendency to scan the horizon for danger can turn into anxiety. And the concern about whether your social standing is okay in the tribe, when we were hunter gatherers, was super important, because if you were going to be ostracized, then you're going to die. You're not going to survive alone. So it was super important to know that you were well positioned and not in any kind of danger in the tribe. Um, it's not a life or death situation today if we have a falling out with a friend, but that legacy of the importance will cause us to ruminate ad nauseum, to sit and spend 5 hours going through one version of a fantasy argument or a fantasy telling off that you're never going to have to your boss or to whoever. And the impulse to do that is incredibly powerful. It's a rabbit hole people spend a lot of time in. And when they're in that rabbit hole, by the way, all they're doing is they're marinating in stress and in cortisol and doing major damage for their body, depressing themselves, stressing themselves, again, for a conversation they even will tell you in a moment they will never have. So we have a lot of tendencies that are very unhealthy. And so a lot of what I practice is catching those and stopping them and not indulging them, despite how compelling that might feel to do.
Is it safe to say that that is kind of our default, is to ruminate?
Not everyone's. No, it's a personal thing. Some of us have a much bigger tendency towards doing that than others. Some people are remarkable at shrugging things off, at compartmentalizing, at reframing things. So I'm not bothered by it. They're not the majority, but there are many, who do
Yeah.
that. And it's all some kind of bell curve, where a distribution where some people do it a lot at the ends and very little at the other ends, and most of us do somewhat in the middle. And but it's a very strong tendency, and the more stressed we feel, the more likely we are to do it. The more upset we feel, the more depressed we feel, the more anxious we feel. All of those things feed the tendency to ruminate. And just to clarify something for the viewers and listeners, um, it is useful to self-reflect on our experiences. That's something we do by default to gain meaning, to gain understanding, to get our bearings, to get action items out of it. It's natural to do that. There are healthy and unhealthy ways to self-reflect. The unhealthy ways involve a form of rumination, where you're really just spinning and having the same unproductive cycle of thoughts over and over again. You'll relive that argument that you had, or you'll again have the fantasy argument, or you'll really think of how unfair this is, and then you'll go through a greatest hits of all the times you were treated unfairly. Of course, you're feeling horrible as you're doing this. A difference between physical and emotional health is like if you sprain or break a leg, and you think back to the time you broke your leg's not going to hurt from the recollection. You think back to a time you were incredibly aggravated, you will get aggravated, even if it's 30 years ago. So every time we marinate in those things, we are literally reliving those wounds, picking at scabs is what I call it. And it's really bad to do, because it doesn't lead anywhere. We're not gaining insight. We're not figuring anything out. We're not getting new perspective. We're not finding the silver lining. We are just marinating in the bad. Sometimes we'll do it alone in our heads. Sometimes we'll call a friend and tell them about the horrible thing that happened. And then we'll call another friend and tell them about the horrible thing that happened. And we can call 10 friends and tell them the same story, and they're all going to say the same thing. The validation feels useful, but the ROI is terrible, because you might feel validated for a bit, but that's going to last for 2 seconds. And meanwhile, you've just put yourself in a bad mood, and you've painted a picture of the world as being really negative, which is going to impact your perceptions, your mood, your confidence, your self-esteem, and all kinds of other things.
Would you say folks are more vulnerable to rumination and not being able to start the cycle when they're sleep deprived, under recovered? I would imagine that's the case, but would love to hear your thoughts on just how some of the kind of physical, like physiological things can kind of manifest and heighten some of those responses to, some of these natural tendencies that we all have.
Yeah, when we are depleted, energy wise, because we've overtrained, underslept, undernourished, whatever the thing is, we're depleted not just in physiological resources, but in mental resources as well. So all our thresholds will get lower. That threshold above which we get triggered for anger, or we start to ruminate, or we get upset, or we get anxious, all those thresholds come down. We are much more prone to do those things because, our reserves have been taxed. So, as a general rule, it's not true for everything all the time, but as a general rule, if you're feeling that you're physiologically depleted, unrecovered, unrested, that's how you're gonna be in the mental side and the emotional side, certainly, as well. So you need to know that, because then if you're going into a situation where that might not be the best time to have a really important talk with your partner, your wife or your husband, whatever it is, because you might not be in the best frame of mind for it. Just like after you're recovering from a marathon, maybe not the best time to do a 10K the next day, kind of thing. So we have to be aware of where we are physiologically, because that's going to impact where we are emotionally and vice versa.
Amazing. Would you say, kind of staying on rumination for a second, just because I feel like it's such an important,
Mhm.
I think it's the feature of the human experience, right? But there's making sense of a scenario, and then there's ruminating. So maybe just talk through, how do you help a patient who is, kind of going beyond just making sense and really kind of constantly ruminating? How do you get them off that track? How do you get them into a healthier place in terms of thinking
Right.
about this problem? Or
So actually, let's look at an example of an athlete who trained for a long time for a race, an event, competition, and
or the Olympics
didn't
and
do
didn't
well.
make it? Yeah, that'd be me. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So say that. I'm so sorry for that, but
No,
say that.
that's all right.
It's absolutely devastating, and because you train for such a long time, the window to succeed is so small. Then the window passes, the wait is so long. You might not be in the same condition. It's often people really dedicate years and years and years for that one goal that then doesn't happen. It is extraordinarily natural to grieve that, to really be in a tailspin about that, and to ruminate about, oh, if I had just done that different, if I had just done this different, if I were able to just maybe if I could go back mentally. I know I kind of felt shaky in that corner, but if I could have just taken that corner again, and you can spend hours doing that, and days and years and months, and you can thoroughly feel like, what's the point of trying if, like, you put so much into something and then it gets snatched away from you? I can go on and on and on, but not to belabor the point, but
Yeah.
you can go down those rabbit holes. Now, when something like that happens, there's a due diligence to be done for sure. It is highly useful to look at what you can learn from that experience, what you can learn from that failure, as it were. And what you can learn from it, you have to approach that with zero judgment. It is useful to say, for example, I should never have gone to that party 2 days before the race, because even though I left early, it was a distraction. I shouldn't have done it. Legit. Not legit. I'm such an idiot. Why did I do that? I'm a loser. I'm never going to get it like that. Not useful, because the message was, shouldn't have gone to party. All the loser idiot stuff adds zero value and does a lot of damage. And it is our want to become very self critical in such moments. Now, an adaptive way to think about those things is to do the due diligence, to give yourself time to grieve the loss when it's a big deal, but to then move on. In other words, you're in the mire. Don't get sucked into it waist high. Try and wade in, feel what the feelings are, get informed by the emotions that are coming up for you. You'd be surprised, because maybe you feel loss and devastation and embarrassment and all kinds of things, but maybe there's also a bit of relief. Maybe there's also a bit of not too bad because it was such a sacrifice for your personal life, for your professional life, or and maybe now this frees you up to do the and emotions are complex. So figure out what the feelings are, get informed by them, but then you have to get yourself away from the rumination. So to do that, you have to one option to do that is to reframe, because the urge to ruminate is about the urge to like scratch that wound. To reframe is to take the toxicity out of that poison, to take the barb, loosen the barb that's kind of lodged in your head that keeps you spinning. One way to reframe this kind of experience was that this is going to make me stronger, because now I know what it's like to really dedicate myself, to really train, to really get there. This didn't work out for me because of A, B, and C. I learned what I needed to from that. Where else can I take? I mean, maybe I'll just try again and figure out what I do differently. Or where else can I take this wisdom and apply it in other areas of my life that I can benefit from the lessons that I've learned? How can I turn this disappointment into fuel, into motivation, into drive? How can I use this moment in which the eyes are on me for not succeeding to strengthen my personal relationships, to feel more connected to the people around me? People care about me. They're reaching out. It's an opportunity to actually feel the love of the people around me, to feel the support, which I don't ordinarily do because I'm too busy training. There's a lot of different ways. I'm just giving some examples I'm throwing out. But in every situation, you can look for a different perspective that's less toxic and less dramatic and has more pluses, more, and doing that helps release the urge to ruminate as much. And ultimately with rumination, if you just keep going back to it, what the research says is a 2 to 3 minute distraction will get you off that cycle. It's like craving for cigarettes for people who stop smoking. The craving is not consistent, it's a wave, just you got to ride that wave. So the same with the urge to ruminate. And what the research says, 2 to 3 minutes of concentrating on something else. So reading a book's not going to do it; it's too passive. My go-to is Wordle. It's good for one
Oh,
rumination a
nice.
day, because
Uh-huh.
so that's not so good. But it can be anything that requires concentration, a memory task. Try and remember the names of the kids who sat around you in grade school, whatever, or the order of the songs in a playlist. That concentrating for 2 minutes is enough for that wave to pass, and then go about your business and repeat the exercise if the rumination occurs.
Breathing techniques, I feel like, are money for me, because it's really hard to think about anything as you're breathing, and focusing on a specific kind of
Because
cadence.
you're
I feel like
counting your
that's really,
breaths. You
yeah,
have to count,
exactly.
right?
You
And
have to count.
and
Yeah. So
but
it's,
here's the other why. That's the two reasons that breathing, more than two, but the other reason that breathing is really important is when you are ruminating about dramatic things, up goes your heart rate, up goes your blood pressure, right? And your breathing becomes more, shallow and more accelerated. You're getting less, oxygen. So slowing your breathing, doing, box
box
breathing, whatever the
breathing,
breathing
or
technique that,
yeah.
that you prefer, is a way of slowing your breathing. It is telling your brain, it's a brain hack. You're telling your brain, really? Because if it were that bad, would I be breathing this slowly? No. So it couldn't be that bad. And you're activating
Right.
your
You bring that
parasympathetic
safety
nervous
back.
system, and your brain, right. And your brain goes, oh, I guess it's not too terrible because we're breathing really slowly. And down goes the heart rate and all of those things. So it's actually a really holistic response to do the breathing along with these other exercises. Breathing is an amazing thing to regulate when we're dysregulated.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something we actually have the feature built into the app. We measure stress. It's called the stress monitor, and we have breathing techniques that you can use to kind of, if you recognize you're in kind of this heightened state of stress, you have the ability to deploy this. It's called the physiological sigh. It's a double inhale followed by an extended exhale, and it calms the nervous system and reduces
Mm-hmm.
anxiety and your perception of stress in the
Right.
moment, and even after the session's over. So we really anchor around breathing as an awesome strategy to kind of deal with perceptions of stress. And yeah.
Right, and
You,
and let me just say something about it, because that mimics a sigh, right? That the double
yeah,
inhale exhale mimics a
mm-hmm,
sigh in a way, and
that's right.
sighing is, people have the wrong idea about sighing. They kind of think like, well, what's that, a sign of this or that? But it's actually an amazing release, and it's actually an amazing recalibrator. The same is true of crying, by the
Yep.
way. People think, oh, that's a
Yeah.
sign of weakness. No, it's actually a great recovery mechanism because it releases a lot of stress and you kind of, reset after a
Yeah.
cry. And so some people
Crying
have trouble
stimulates
crying.
the
Some
vagus
people,
nerve.
yes, it's a very, very useful thing that we judge very incorrectly.
I totally agree. Like when I have a good cry, I swear, like my next day recovery is so much higher. Like my heart rate variability is higher next day. Like I always, whenever it's part of this, I think just that release and just that acknowledgement. And, there's an element of, kind of grief and letting go. And, I think that comes along with crying that I think is really powerful. And it's interesting to see that manifest in the data.
Yeah, and sometimes people come to me and they'll argue with me and they'll go like, "Well, I never cry," and I'll be like, "Well, I'm so sorry, and I hope one day you do have access to your feelings."
Good. That's a shake 'em up. I like it. That's awesome. You said something. I think that's like so important. You said space to grieve. Maybe talk about creating space for oneself because I feel like in today's world there are so many distractions. We have access to food. We have access to social media. We can watch Netflix for hours on end. With shows that are really interesting to us. Like there's an element of and this sounds so cliche, but actually sitting with our thoughts so we can start to understand what is actually coming into our brain and whether or not those thoughts are serving us. But I think there's distraction, but there's also creating space for yourself so you can kind of sift through some of those emotions because they'll surface in I think maladaptive ways if we don't actually deal with them. So maybe just talk through like what does space actually mean and we can take grief as an anchor point potentially, thinking about it from romantic heartbreak or the loss of a loved one and maybe use that as
Right.
an example.
So, yes, I completely agree that we need the space to sit with our thoughts, but it's our thoughts and our feelings that we need to sit with. And we are remarkably, our emotional vocabulary tends to be very limited. Some more than others, but
Such a good
we
point.
generally see, when I ask people, well, how do you feel in that moment? I get primary colors, right? It's like happy, sad, angry, I don't know, not great, like, so I tell people all the time, and I truly do use this myself. There's something called the emotion wheel, where you have a wheel of all the different emotions grouped by kind of category. Here, all the angers, resentments, the this, the positive ones, challenging ones, all of them. And I say to my patients, and I say to friends, even, and I use it myself. I'm in a moment, I'm feeling a lot. It's difficult to unpack, and I start looking at the wheel and anything that registers on the radar. There could be a 2 here and a 10 there, and when you start, there can be 20 different feelings that you're experiencing in that moment. That's a lot of data. That's a lot of information to actually look at and go, okay, if I'm feeling all of these things, let me figure out what's this about and what's that about, and well, why some relief there? Why some happiness there? Oh yeah, because I really don't like that person, so I didn't mind. Like it just to really kind of unpack what's going on, that we need the space and time for. And it's especially true when we're grieving. It's true of every emotional injury we sustain, to be honest. When I said earlier that it's very obvious for people who are active that they need time to train, or they need time to warm up, or they need time to cool down, this is the training when it comes to emotional health. This is the time that you devote when something big happens in your life. It doesn't You don't get over it automatically. When I talk about heartbreak, romantic heartbreak, for example, I have a TED talk about it. It has over 15 million views, and the reason it has so many views is because people's idea of romantic heartbreak is time. Just give it time, and A, that is useful, and B, there's so much more we could be doing to make that time shorter and to make our suffering less, except that we're not aware of what those tools are. And again, there involve do's and don'ts. That's true of any kind of grieving. There are things we can do to process the grief. And it's not one size fits all. Different people need different things. There's some people who need to talk about it all the time. There's some people who would rather not. But you don't have to talk about it, but you have to process it. Grief means you are getting your brain adapted and your heart heart, not literally, but emotionally, adapt it to a new reality of a loss. And that takes time. It doesn't happen on a dime. It takes time to accommodate. For you wake up in the morning, oh, that person isn't there, or that person broke up with me, or that goal of mine that I've dedicated so many years to is now gone. You're a different person in a way after a loss. And so it takes time to sit with, to adapt to process, to understand, to see how it impacts the different areas of your life, and to experience the feelings that it evokes. And so we sometimes don't do that naturally. When it comes to heartbreak, our tendency is to do all the wrong things, right? Our tendency, I know this person broke my heart. I'm going to spend 16 hours of every waking moment stalking them on social media, so I can see this curated version of that they put out in which they seem terribly happy and feel miserable by it. I mean, that's what people do. Hours. I know it's not good for me. I know it makes me unhappy, but I just have to see what they're doing. You don't have to. You're allowing yourself to. You're indulging a bad urge. If you had the urge to slice your arm open, hopefully you wouldn't indulge it, because you would realize, well, that's silly. But those negative emotional psychological urges, we indulge way too much. Because we don't know that it's that damaging. And once I explain to people how and why and the extent to which it is, people go like, okay, maybe not. But there's one. Another one, we become significantly, when it's a romantic breakup, we become intensely self-critical. In our effort to understand the why, which is important, we feel that it's necessary to review all our faults and shortcomings. And then, oh, if only I were this, if only I were that, if only I didn't, if only I did. Your faults and shortcomings, like if there are things you can work, if it was like, oh, I should never have said that to his friend, and that, lesson learned there. Maybe there's something to be taken away. But I'm not tall enough, I'm not rich enough, I'm not big enough, I'm not small enough, I'm not this, I'm not this. What's the point? What you should be doing in that moment is entirely the opposite. After a heartbreak, after a romantic rejection, even doesn't have to be heartbreak, you should be listing all the qualities you bring to the table, not highlighting what you don't. Your self-esteem is already hurting. You don't need to savage it further. You want to actually revive it. And that happens by really focusing on, well, here are the things that I know I have to offer that other people have or would appreciate. Let me focus on those, because that's going to make me more hopeful for the future, as opposed to feeling like I'll never find anyone, because you just reviewed everything that you think is wrong with you.
Would you say higher self-esteem, higher baseline self-esteem, the shorter the time to kind of get over the rejection? Is
In
self-esteem
general,
kind of
yes.
one of those
Self-esteem
levers
is a
that,
buffer, is a
yeah,
buffer for rejection, for anxiety, for certain things. Our self-esteem fluctuates. Some of us are set at a regular baseline that's higher than others. But there's a Goldilocks zone for self-esteem. Too high tends to get brittle. Then you fall into the narcissism range, and then you might think a lot of yourself, but you're also intolerant of any criticism or any negativity, because internally your self-esteem it might be high, but it's brittle. It breaks easy. So that's not good either. Too low, then you're too self-critical, too unconfident, see yourself in a really negative prism rather than a realistic one. There's a happy zone in the middle. But self-esteem, I always say, it's like having a bad hair day, when I used to have enough hair to have one. It's like you can wake up feeling like crap about yourself, and you can wake up feeling great. And why? Maybe Whoop has some correlations and answers that we can get to in terms of self-esteem, and why, what's happening to us physiologically, what happened during the night or the day before that promotes that. But in general, like, it can fluctuate, and and there are other programs to improve self-esteem. They don't work, because they give you an initial boost of a day or two. And when we do studies, some people will come out of a self-esteem weekend and say that they're in a much better place, that their self-esteem is higher. But when you give them self-esteem questionnaires, there's no difference.
so
So
interesting.
it's, yeah, because self-esteem is a very specific thing. And today we like to talk about self-compassion instead of self-esteem. It's a much more useful concept. And self-compassion means, what's the extent to which you have a compassionate internal voice rather than a critical one, or a fawning one for that matter, a compassionate one in which you just treat yourself as you would a dear friend.
In what way do we have to after a romantic heartbreak, what is a healthy shift in identity? Because sometimes, I know that your identity can be really wrapped up in that other human, and, um, I feel like that's probably not super healthy. How does one kind of think about that? And they might be in a what is a kind of a great relationship, but is it important for them to recognize that, oh, wow, my identity is actually really, really wrapped up in this person? And how do you kind of pull back without making that person feel rejected, even though you might not be breaking up, but you just are kind of pulling yourself out a little bit to kind of reclaim your sense of self a bit? And I don't know. I think about protecting in the event that it doesn't work out, and I know that might not be the right way to think about it. But what's your take on
So
how
that's
to?
a great question, right? Because the way we enter into romantic relationships is not sustainable.
Right.
We get infatuated. Our brain gets addicted, literally,
Mhm.
to the no, truly to the other
Yeah,
person.
totally.
It looks like addiction. It looks like
Right.
we become obsessed,
It's like opioid,
and
right? Like it's like
it's
literally.
very much like an opioid. It's the only thing that makes us happy. Nothing else really matters, And then suddenly we didn't hear from them for a few hours. Now we go into withdrawal. Now we're in a severe panic, and so we just want to spend every minute with them, every second with them. And maybe at the beginning, if the feeling is mutual, that's terrific. It's not sustainable. You're not going to be fused like that. You want to avoid codependency because that is a problematic. That's like a blurring of boundaries. It's an enmeshment that's not actually useful psychologically or emotionally, nor is it sustainable. And so, but it's very much what you described is very much true of a lot of people when they enter in, they're just so smitten and it's mutual. And then at some point they realize, I haven't seen my best friend in like 3 months. I haven't done this. I stopped going to this class I loved. I stopped listening to this music because I'm with them all the time and they don't love that artist. So I'm not listening to that. It's very important to reclaim your independence. You have to communicate about it. You have to have a conversation and say, hey, look, this is amazing, almost a little too much so because I haven't noticed, but I've been neglecting a lot of things that I really used to enjoy doing. I'm sure you have too. So, can we talk about being able to slowly kind of re-engage in some of those other things? It might mean seeing each other a little bit less. We might need to reassure each other that we're very much still in it, but this feels good to me. I want it to work, and I know that I'm not going to be happy in the long term if I don't do this thing, and if I stop training, I stop doing this, I stop doing that. Those are not things that are going to make me happy in the long term. I got carried away, and I'm glad I did because we have a great launching pad. But now we have to shift gears a little bit and make this more sustainable. Is that okay with you? Tell me how you feel about that.
Yeah. In a scenario where there's been a breakup, how do you kind of and let's say you were really codependent previously, and now you've broken up, and you're trying to reclaim that identity. What would be the process to kind of get back to your sense of self?
So, number one, you need to start asking yourself, what do I want to keep that I took on during that relationship? Maybe I was introduced to this kind of music or this kind of food, or I got into this habit. You don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. What is something that I would like to keep associated with my ex or no? And what are the things I don't? Identity is a real issue because we go from being a we when we're in a relationship to an I. So there's a massive shift in personal identity from a we, like, how was your weekend? Well, we did this and this and this for the holidays. Well, we did this for the weekend. Well, we're going to see this film, to I. And that can feel like a huge loss, at the beginning and part of that loss. And so identity reformation is something we have to do whenever life throws a curve at us that's tilted us significantly. Loss often does that. Physical injury can do that. When an athlete has to retire from the sport they love because they no longer can perform at the professional level, there's a loss. Gymnasts go through that at very young ages. Dancers go through that at very young ages. They devoted their entire lives. That's who they were. And now they cannot be that anymore. So who are they? There's an exploration. Identity is not something we curate from, I'll take a little piece of this, a little piece of that. It's something we have to ask ourselves, discover in ourselves, wrestle with. It's a very active process of figuring out, well, what do I think? What do I believe? One example is we all raised in homes in which there was a position on politics, religion, all the hot button topics. And we can adopt wholesale where we came from, but maybe we need to pause and go, but what do I think? And maybe what I think or what I believe turns out to be similar. Maybe it turns out to be different. Maybe it turns out to be different, but I want to stay with that community, so I'll adapt. Or maybe it turns out to be different to the point that I really need to not hide that I feel differently. All of that is a result of exploration, asking yourself questions, being honest with yourself about the answers. And what we have to be careful of, again, with the heartbreak and stalking people, or with identity and just quickly coming up with an answer that's not well thought through. Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll do Eat, Pray, Love. I'll just go on a trip and da 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 da, and that will be the well. That's a great book and movie, but it's not something most people can, would, should do, right? And I have a newsletter. It's called the Do Wrong, the Get Wrong, Do Right newsletter, because every month it goes through one thing we get very, very wrong, and that we do very wrong, and how to do it right. It can be things like apologies that we get very wrong because we make them about our excuses rather than about the feelings of the other person. It can be how we deal with rejection, which is to become self-critical and think it's because of us, when often it's not. And there's no point in becoming self-critical. Somebody already did that for you. Like there's so and it's important people to understand the mistakes so that they don't amplify negativity, or they don't make wounds, emotional or otherwise, bigger. When it comes to identity, part of our mistakes is that we don't think of it as an active question of who am I? When you ask people, and if anyone who's listening wants to ask a friend, who are you? They'll get demographics. This age, this, I do this, what's on your driver's license, kind of thing. That's part of who you are. But who you are is what you believe, is what you feel. You might, unbeknownst to a lot of people, spend 4 hours a day drawing comics that no one knows about. But if you're spending 4 hours a day on art, you're an artist. In part, that's part of who you are. And I, for example, can cook a meal for people, and if they literally expel it back onto the plate, my feelings will not be hurt, because the cook is not a part of my identity. It's not something I do well, think I do well, that's important for me to do well. So, if I get criticism there, it bothers me less. If somebody will come and say, you don't understand anything about what's going on with me, I'll find that more upsetting, because as a psychologist, I would hope I would. And so, it's the different aspects to our identity, to our self-esteem, and those different aspects have different meanings, and they're complex. There are overall sense of identity, and our identity. How do I feel as a partner? How do I feel as a son? How do I feel as a brother? And good brother, good friend, bad, like, what are my qualities? What do I bring to the table? All of this is an exploration. So you start by asking a lot of questions and seeing what resonates with you emotionally, what comes up, what you feel. And it's a process. And the process of identity formation is a lifelong process, because we go through changes and
We
losses and
evolve.
adaptations all the time. We're not the same person.
Yeah. And it seems like that kind of part of retaining the sense of self that is so important, the more we kind of have a clear definition of who we want to be in the world, it seems as though that would be a real buffer to a lot of the vulnerable, being, that would make us a little less vulnerable. I would think. And I think a big piece of this too is environment, kind of creating an environment where we can reinforce that identity, and an outlet for the things that enable us to kind of almost practice that identity. Maybe if you want to talk a little bit about that, because I think, oftentimes that's where we kind of go wrong with emotional health, and that, our environment, our friend group aren't in line with the things that we say we really care about and that we value. And as a result, we get this mismatch in terms of our behaviors and what we say we care about, and the person that I want to be in this world. So maybe talk a little bit about emotional health and just environment and boundaries.
Okay, so emotional health, when it comes to identity, it's you. If you're an athlete, say, and you don't have a social circle of athletes, you don't get to express. You can tell them this or that statement, but you're not really discussing. You don't feel a part of a community of athletes, and that's really damaging to your sense of identity. It's almost like you have to bury a part of yourself that's super important. And so we get validation and we get to explore identities when we have a group affiliation of people who feel the same about themselves, who we have that in common with. And there's huge power to that group affiliation because the research is, for example, that when people encounter bias, if they're really affiliated with the group of people towards whom that bias went, they are much more buffered because they're almost like sharing the insult with the group rather than sustaining it individually or being picked out individually. It feels very different to face bias when you feel like you're standing alone versus when you feel like, no, there are people behind me who feel the same, know the same, experience the same, and would understand completely if I told them what just happened. So that group affiliation part is super important for our identity. It's where we really can strengthen and can experience that those aspects of ourselves. And again, it's not writ large. We're not one thing. We're many things. So that group affiliation, let's say you're a Black person and you experience bias, being with Black people, because you can't be Black and not experience bias, so they will get it, hopefully, and that is very, very strong, in that way. And you asked about boundaries. It's the subject of the most recent newsletter. What we get wrong about boundaries is when we're, and I'm talking about the boundaries we try to set with other people to let them know when they're stepping on our toes. That's my analogy of it. Like somebody stepped on your toes. They didn't realize, I didn't realize you had a toe there. I do. So you just stepped on it. And when you set boundaries with someone and you say, hey, so this is where you don't step because that's where my toes are. That's where I have a sensitivity, or that's where you do something that I don't find comfortable or pleasant. What people get wrong about that is they think it's a one-step process. It's hard enough to have the talk with someone about boundaries. Now, look, this happened. Da, 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 da. And when they're done, everyone's like, I got through it, or there was a fight, or whatever it was. Boundaries is a two-step process. The small step is the first one, in which you set the boundary. The big step is everything that happens thereafter, in which you maintain the boundary. Boundaries always have to be maintained. We don't live in a magical society where your requests gets internalized and adhered to immediately by all around you. That would be nice. Not the case. Even people who care about you will get it wrong a lot. So as long as you know that, and you know that you need to maintain the boundary, remind people, do it as nicely as possible, as non-confrontationally as possible. If you don't, you're giving them the message that, that thing that I said, it really upsets me when you do. Sometimes it's fine, is the message you're giving when you don't maintain the boundary, which is confusing to the other person, so they'll do it. So even in boundaries, it's important to be actively maintaining them. And again, I get back to the message about emotional health, which is it is an active daily process of self-examination and getting the information, because it starts with the fact that this information is not out there. People don't know it, so they don't know how to do and when. But once you have that information, that's where the work begins. It's like you can get all the equipment, but then the training begins, and you got to show up in the gym. It won't happen magically.
Right. And it's crazy because you think about, I think about myself, like how much I program my workouts and like think about when I'm going to do cardiovascularly and strength perspective, the recovery modalities I'm going to engage in, which has a correlation, a relationship to emotional and mental health for sure. But in terms of like really carving out like actual real time to think about my emotional health, you're dead on. No one does it. 0.0001% of the population is engaging in some sort of like real time that is set aside each day. And meditation, mindfulness, I think these are all paths potentially, but what would that time frame like really look like if we're thinking about like building this muscle, this skill of emotional health? Like what does that time frame need to look like for us?
So, okay, let's distinguish between injury recovery and maintenance and training. So the injury recovery is I got rejected, I sustained a loss, I had a failure, I had like something that really...
So like emotional injury where you're just...
tilts you off.
Yeah.
Emotional injury, it tilts you off the track, it tilts you off your center, and you just want to soldier on and keep going. There are really specific tools and techniques. My book, Emotional First Aid, was that. Like, here's a toolkit to use for daily life, small stuff. But you can treat those injuries. I sustain failures as much as everyone else, but every time I do, I am in the spot. My best example of this was like I was about to give a really important talk, and 3 weeks before the talk, I had a rehearsal, and it got torn apart. Torn apart while I'm on stage rehearsing. In the room was like, this is bad, and I was like, we're ready to go. It's 3 weeks away, and
Wow.
what went through my head is, you wrote so many articles and chapters about failure. Do it. Do what you need to do. So it's like I was, don't be frozen. Do.
Yeah.
And I
Practice what you preach.
it bounced me out of it, and I immediately started like remembering. Okay, here's what I would have suggested for someone to do in that moment. Do that. And I certainly, and to get the emotions, to get this not dysregulated, I immediately became intensely curious about what was the direction they thought I should be going in. What is it they think the right thing would be? Listen really carefully. If they think this is bad, they're not just saying this is bad, they have an idea. So listen, be there and work with them and collaborate with them now as you're on stage and sweating bullets. Do it now. And I have that on video, in fact. And I went to look at it, like a week or two later, after I had rewritten the thing and it was approved and nicely so. And I was like so proud of myself for being able to implement my own advice in a difficult moment. And the
Oh my
point of
gosh,
that is
that's
it's difficult. It's really emotionally uncomfortable. But that's the training. That's the idea that you're sustaining a wound. Triage it now. Don't let it fester. Don't let it get infected. Be on it. And so treating injuries, is one thing. And the other is the building up, is working on your identity, working on gratitude. I think mindfulness and meditation, especially mindfulness meditation, are amazing. There's so much research about that. I'm not, again, it's all evidence-based stuff that I tend to go for here. And those are wonderful things. I'm not great at meditation. I practice it intermittently. I'm not very good at it because I
the
haven't
same.
spent enough time training the
Mm.
muscle to
Right.
be able to sit and do it for sustained, and by sustained I mean 10 minutes. I'm not good. It's like I open my eyes and like, well, that must have been an hour. Oh, look,
I know.
3 minutes.
I know.
It's like that. But it's like there's a lot of muscles you can train. That's not the one I
Right.
focus on, but I should, and I know that, and it's on the list of things. But there's so much you can do to train emotionally, psychologically, to beef up yourself, to learn things, to reframe difficult things so that they're more optimistic. When you feel discouraged, to restore your motivation. When you feel rejected, to restore your self-esteem. When you feel helpless, to restore a sense of control. When you feel anxious, to restore a sense of certainty. I can go on and on and on and on and on. There are active things we can be doing every day to beef ourselves up, and especially to address the impediments that we should be doing in a natural way, like we do when it comes to our physiological and physical health, but we know less about the emotion and the psychological health, so we don't do as much. But that's where the training is.
Do you feel like the world is becoming more aware and more conscious of just some of these tools that exist? And at least, we're not there yet in terms of practicing these skills regularly. But do you feel like the conversation is at a better place, globally around
So
mental
I
and
think the
emotional health?
pandemic, yes, and I think the pandemic did a lot there. I'm a psychologist who writes books, has TED Talks, gives talks. That's, but I'm not, the head of this department at this university. And a year and a half ago, and this is slight humble brag, but you'll indulge me for a minute. I got invited to 10 Downing Street in England to speak to the British government, and they said, we want to hear what your recommendations are for mental health policies we should institute across the UK. And I literally said to them, that's amazing. Why on earth are you asking me? And their response was, because you'll be talking to policymakers and bureaucrats and those kinds of people. And we need somebody who can talk to people in way, and not talk at people. And you're good at
It's not an
communicating
academic
your
lecture.
thoughts and your
This is a
science.
conversation.
Correct. We've had those. It bores them. They don't do anything. And so I went in talking to them about work stress and about, because one thing I knew, all of them, maybe they're depressed, maybe they're anxious, all of them are stressed. The nature of the beast when it comes to being a civil servant in any government. And so I talk them about work stress and how they need to think differently about work stress, and the idea that the interesting thing about work stress is that we don't experience it at work. We're too busy. We experience it outside of work in the form of worry, anxiety, rumination, all of those things. And because that's the case, we have much more control over it than we actually think. And so I just went in with a whole, and I gave those talks to a lot of different companies because that idea of how you manage yourself and your own stress is super important. And that really spoke to them. And they even instituted a law based on the talk at some point. And so the idea that, again, I apologize for the humble brag, but the point I wanted to make is
No,
I
it's
don't
beautiful.
think that would have happened pre-pandemic. I think the pandemic made the point with everyone, like everyone who thought I'm immune, I don't need this, I don't get depressed, I don't get lonely. Well, the whole world shut down and we don't know if the fabric of civil society is going to hold. Let's see how you feel right now. So I
Yeah.
think after the pandemic, people were much more open to the idea. Unfortunately, this is a window that will close very soon because as humans, we like to not think about, those kinds of things and just assume that we're all robust and immune. And so that awareness in the shadow of a huge worldwide global event is not going to last once life comes back to normal and is already almost there. And so there is a window of opportunity for people to get informed and to take on board half the equation that they've been missing.
I love that. I mean, there's no question. Our thesis at Whoop is very much around, it's not what's happening in your craft. Like during those 8 hours that you're, in the emergency, you're acute care surgeon, like, dealing with a huge trauma that just happened, or, a military operator, professional athlete, like your craft, that's kind of the easy part. It is the other, kind of 13, 14, 15 hours of the day that's what you need to manage. And I think that's where the opportunity is really, and I love that you had this opportunity to kind of talk to folks about that concept. And when you talked about kind of work stress and the stress that's happening outside of work and how to manage it, did you kind of talk about it from like a physiological and psychological lens in terms of like how you actively manage stress and just components like
Yes. I
sleep
mean, first of all,
yeah.
When you're ruminating about work in the off hours, you are going to have sleep disturbances. That's what the research shows. You're going to eat unhealthier foods because you're trying to soothe. You're going to be if you're chronic, you're going to be more at risk for cardiovascular disease because you're flooding your system with cortisol and other unhealthy hormones and mental states over big hours of time, and unnecessarily so. So you're literally predisposed. I also spoke about loneliness, for example. People think loneliness is unpleasant. Yes, it's unpleasant. It will also kill you. Loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It impairs longevity. It will make you infirmed and sick compared to somebody who's not lonely, and it will kill you early. The chances of an early death rise by 30-something% with chronic loneliness. These are huge physical and longevity manifestations. There's research even about smiling and mental attitude, that you look at the smiles of kindergarten kids in these very long-term studies and you count the crow's feet around their eyes, and those kids on average live longer than the ones with fewer crow's feet, just in terms of the smile and their approach to the world. Because when kids smile with crow's feet, that's an authentic smile. When they just put up the thing, it's not. So you can see the kids who are able at that point to really connect to a happy moment. And that's hugely impactful to how long we live and the health we have. So yes, the mind-body connection is huge. We're at we're at the initial stages of that mountain of excavating exactly all the ways in which it operates. I'm excited for the years to come because I think we'll discover so much more, and that doing that will give us all kinds of pathways, not just to emotional and psychological, but to physical health and performance in athletics and every other domain, because it impairs thinking, cognitive thinking, for example. So I'm very hopeful that we'll learn more and more about those things, and I'm very hopeful that private citizens with Whoop, with other devices, and with the sophistication that is just starting and will become much more informed about their own mental processes, physiological processes, the connection between the two, and be able to have much more control over this aspect of their lives that we literally didn't have any control over a short
Yeah,
while ago.
that's so beautifully said. I love that. Maybe, we're getting toward the end here, but I'd love to ask you just, some folks are still working from home, um, are kind of remote working. Maybe, what have you learned over the course of the last few years with just now this very new model of work? What have been some of the benefits of working from home? And yeah, what's your just kind of overall take on what goes
Hmm.
right, what goes wrong, in terms of emotional health?
Yeah. Look, the science is that, and this was pre-pandemic, we're as productive, if not more, at home as we are in the office. The downsides, the many pros and cons, but just to be very brief about it, the downsides are that that lack of face time can be a disadvantage. If somebody's able to be in the office and somebody not, then they have more access. They might have certain advantages, more face time with the boss, and that can be an advantage for them. What people started doing at some point, and I gave a ton of talks at the beginning of the pandemic to so many different companies, saying like, you have to add elements to meetings which are connective, emotionally connective between people, because otherwise people are going to feel hugely disconnected, and that's going to impact their employee loyalty, their engagement, their productivity, their happiness. Your attrition rates are going to grow. And so people need to feel connected. They don't have a break room to meet in, coincidentally. I said, like, for example, you go to a meeting, you leave your cubicle, you say hello to this one over there, you rub the shoulder of that one over there, you go to the break room, you get coffee, you chat for a few minutes, you get there early, oh, how's your kid doing? Da, 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 da.
Yeah,
None of
absolutely.
that existed when the group meetings began virtually. And yeah, you have to you have to introduce it artificially. You have to bring in, and again, that's a leadership thing. The leaders have to start by saying, let's do a round and check in with everyone about how we're doing. I'll start. I'll say something vulnerable. You don't announce that, you just do it. But I'll say something slightly emotionally vulnerable to demonstrate to you that it's okay, that we're here to support one another, that we're a team, we're working together, we spend more hours together than we do with our families. Let's care for one another more. Companies who have a central tenet of caring, and they're not many, do much better in terms of the what they get out of their employees, because people want to be cared for when they're devoting so many hours of their life to something. And so that how we manage the hybrid models or the work from home models entirely, it is on us to truly make up for the lack of connectivity. Touch can be important. Like, some people don't are not touching anyone, literally, even if it's a rub on the shoulder. That's an important thing. And of course, these days you want to be careful about rubbing someone's shoulder without consent, but like friends, etc., like we need that. And so it's a really important thing, and I would ask anyone to pay attention. If you're working remotely entirely or in a hybrid model, track yourself. If you're getting data from your Whoop, get data from your brain by adding to whatever the spreadsheet is, things like, and who did I speak to today, and who did I feel connected to, and all of
Mhm.
that.
I love that. What would you say? So if you were to kind of give us kind of your top three or five things to kind of manage your emotional hygiene, what would that laundry list look like for you?
Ask yourself, how am I doing? How am I feeling? And what do those feelings tell me? What information can I gather from them? And when I ask people, how are you feeling? When I say ask yourself, at least 10 feelings have to be there. And you don't have to feel all of them intensely, but understand the complexity of your feelings, understand why you have them. Ask yourself what you want to do with those feelings, which ones are useful to you, which are not. Get informed, because it starts with basic information. That you need to, for example, nutrition wise, people know so much about what they should or should not be eating. They do not know what they should be taking in psychologically or emotionally, what's nutritious, what isn't. Again, people ruminate without understanding that it's not just not nutritious, it's toxic. Certain kinds of self-reflection, like problem solving, or perspective taking or reframing, are actually very nutritious. So get informed, and then start practices, and then track, again, experimental method, track how you do on those practices. And so you have data that tells you this works for you, this doesn't. For example, there are many pain relievers on the market. I know, on over-the-counter pain relievers. When I have a headache, there's one of them that works for me, the others don't. I only know that by trial and error, because there's no magic to it. So this is trial and error. What tends to work for you? You're having a really low day. Who's the friend that really lifts your spirits versus the friend that you're busy, but it didn't really do anything for you? Who made you feel connected? Who made you feel heard? Who, again, it might not be obvious to you. Your best friend might not be the best listener. And if they're the best listener, they might not be the best person to express the validation that you need. They might listen to you go on for 15 minutes about how your heart is broken and go, dude, bummer. Not so useful. We need a little more than that. So ask yourself, be intentional and purposeful in how you curate the people around you, the life you want, the practices you have. See what works for you, make notes of it, and just take it seriously.
I love it. So good. Dang, this is so fun. We appreciate your time so much. You've been just wildly insightful, and I think our members are just going to absolutely love this conversation. So just thank you for your time today. Where's the best place for folks to find you? I know, obviously, we'll link to your books and your TED Talks, and if you have a website, but are you on Instagram, LinkedIn? Yeah,
I'm on everything. TikTok we're starting soon, not yet, but we're starting very soon. But just guywinch.com, GUIWINCH.com. We'll have links to everything I do. The things I would highlight, you'll have links to 3 TED Talks there. You'll have links to 3 books. They're in 30 languages. So if you speak a different language, you probably will find them in your language, even Mongolian most recently. So hello to everyone in Mongolia. And I also have a podcast called Dear Therapists, in which I co-host, in which we do live therapy sessions. So you'll be able to hear live therapy sessions, and in which we give the person advice at the end of the session. They go and do it, and they come back and report what happened. So you really get a complete arc of someone's story, and it also gives you a sense, and it'll make you think, because the questions we ask, our guest, are the questions that you can ask yourself as well in many of these situations, articles, all those things. So you will find a link to the newsletter to subscribe. Really, that's the portal that you can go through, and you should be able to find everything there.
Amazing. Well, thank you again.
Big thank you to Dr. Guy Winch for coming on the Whoop podcast. Emotional health and relationships are critical. If you enjoyed this episode of the Whoop podcast, please leave us a rating or review. Don't forget to subscribe to the Whoop podcast. You can check us out on social at Whoop, at Will Ahmed. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us, podcast@whoop.com. Call us, 508-443-4952, and we'll answer your question on a future episode. New members can use the code WILL, WILL, get a $60 credit on Whoop accessories. And that's a wrap this week. Thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next week on the Whoop podcast. As always, stay healthy and stay in the green.